So today's speaker is a special treat. When the announcement was made that Laurie Patton was going to be president of the college, I was in the auditorium in the chapel, and I saw there were two groups of really happy people: the religion professors and the poets, because she's both. So I'll just let her read. We'll read. She'll read for a while. Maybe we'll do some questions and answers like we did last week, and then some more reading. So, Laurie Patton.
Thank you so much. David, I just want to thank you and this wonderful group. Every week or two at Middlebury is a new surprise of the cool thing that is already here that I didn't know about. And the Otter Creek Poet Society is exactly that. We were just talking about the fact that it should have existed before it actually existed. You sort of would feel like something like this would be in Middlebury already and have existed since Breadloaf or before Breadloaf or given birth to Breadloaf. So I love it when people have ideas that are so simple and needed. And so congrats to you for doing it. And it's so wonderful to see such a great crowd interested in poetry. Poets in general are used to, I follow the Talmudic dictum, which is you speak to one as if you speak to 100, and you speak to 100 as if you speak to one, so that it doesn't matter if two people show up, because you're speaking to 100, and if you have a surprise crowd of 3,000, that happened to me once, and I was expecting 200, I didn't matter, and I think poets really need to follow that. That being said, to have such a wonderful crowd here is really great. And it's particularly wonderful to just take a pause in the middle of the day of being Barbara Bureaucrat to come back to what I truly love, and if I had the courage would probably only do this, but I do see my lack of committing my entire life to poetry as a failure of nerve, and so there it is. So I'm going to read from three different works. The first two are my published works, and the third is a manuscript in progress, which, as David and I were talking about, he particularly wanted to hear about new work. So I think this is I read some of the new work in Jerusalem at a wonderful literary cafe. If any of you are interested in traveling, it's called Small Shilshom, and it means tomorrow and tomorrow. It's based on the title of a novel by a well-known Hebrew writer. It's committed to cafes and books and poetry and literature, really wonderful. So this is really the only second time that I've read from this near completed new manuscript, so that's also very exciting. My background and my niche, insofar as one has a niche, is really commentary on religious texts. And Fire's Goal, Poems from a Hindu Year, are in fact follow the Hindu liturgical year. After my first year, I've lived in India for 4 years, I write scholarly books about Sanskrit literature and Sanskrit poetry, early Indian Sanskrit poetry. So this is really a poetic response to my very first year in India, in which I was studying pilgrimage to sacred water sources, particularly river sources. And I really didn't do anything with that year in a non-scholarly way for about 10 years. So this is the exercise of remembering specific Hindu holidays during that year, knowing and assuming that the memory was the occasion for the poem. The fact that I remembered it should mean, therefore, that I should, 10 years later, should write a poem about it. That is not for everyone. That was just my admonition to myself. The thing that was so interesting about it is I wrote this book when I was in the middle of what we are now experiencing every day of culture wars, identity politics, and white lady writing in a Hindu voice to a Hindu god. How do I sign the book? And the last 8 poems are in Sanskrit, and those are ones that I wrote originally in Sanskrit because they were bad poems, and then I translated them into English, and then they became better poems. If I had written them first in English, they would have been very bad poems. And then they got really kind of interesting. And I'm going to read you 2 of those. So what do you do with this, right? So you, as a writer, you could say, okay, I'll do a pseudonym. and then they would discover that I wasn't actually a Hindu, like Patton. Patton is a wonderful Gujarati name, in fact. But no, then she's white. That would be like Black Elk Speaks. Do you remember that whole controversy where, right, didn't want to go there. And then I could be ambiguous pseudonym like Day. Day is a Bengali name. It's also Doris Day. You know, I didn't. Same thing would happen though. So I thought, okay, just play it straight, and just play it straight. Just in life, you just learn that lesson over and over again. And see what happens, given that lots of Hindu writers and fundamentalist writers were saying, you know, this is our culture, you shouldn't appropriate. The whole controversy about yoga began in the early 2000s. So there I did. Had a friend of mine who's an Indian intellectual write the forward to it, had lots of footnotes in the back. And what was so interesting was, instead of how dare she and don't ever appropriate our culture, the 3 of the 5 reviews that came out said things like Laurie Patton's edition of medieval Sanskrit poetry, Laurie Patton's translations or editing and compilations of ancient Indian poems. And I'm like, no, I wrote them. So it was definitely true that a certain mindset couldn't put the 2 things together at all, but it was a benevolent version of it. It wasn't like, how dare you, don't appropriate. It was like, you couldn't possibly have written this, so you must be faithful editor. Like faithful editor they could do, but writer, an author within Hindu imagery was very hard. The second book also follows the liturgical year, but the Hebrew Bible. And as you may know from the Jewish year, it's where the Christian lectionary idea emerged from. You have a Parshiot, a Shavuot, you have a reading every week. And the same principle applied for me, which is if one line that for every section of the Bible that was the reading for that week, whatever line I remembered most must therefore be the occasion for the poem. And I had set myself the task of doing it in an entire year in some sort of mystical entranced state, and you know, like, who was I kidding? So it took me 4 years, and I kept getting behind, and then I catch up, and so on, to do all of the 50 poems. But this is really a contemplative reading of the Bible, informed by Asian and Buddhist and Hindu sensibilities. And you'll hear, I think, some of that when I read you the poems. The thing that was so interesting about this book was that the book was, people didn't know what to do with the passage, because I would put the passage at the top of the poem, and the rest of the poem was a response to the passage. And people would write, when I would publish it in little journals and things, they'd say, it's a great poem, but just take the Bible stuff out of it. And this was also very interesting, because I couldn't publish individually these poems, because a poem to the Hindu god Agni, the god of fire, like, where are they going to do that? But as a whole, as a collection, several publishers wanted it because it was about India. So that was very interesting. And here, in this book, people really published the individual poems because they understood biblical stories. But as a group of poems, they said, oh, you should get a rabbi to do the foreword so they understand what it is. And in Israel, they said, over our dead bodies, you're going to get a rabbi to do anything if I was going to publish it in Israel. So it was this really interesting moment where here the collection was harder for people to comprehend, but the individual poems they liked, and here they didn't know what to do with the individual poems, but they liked the collection. There is a poetry journal called Agni, which is named after the god of fire. I submitted 5 poems to the journal Agni in 2001 or 2, and they're like, whoa, what is this? We don't get this. And no, thank you. And I submitted 3 Jewish poems to the journal Agni 12 years later, and they're like, oh, we love these. And I'm like, as a Sanskritist, I am going to tell you what Agni means. This is the scariest one, third one, and then I will start reading. The third one is entirely secular. I am so scared about this because it's based on, it's the same discipline, like a calendar, Hindu year, Jewish year, but it's the discipline of architectural elements of a house. So it's very deeply secular. It's corner, floor, window, and so on. Although when I read it in Jerusalem, several poet friends who were there said, this is your most religious book yet. So I'll let you decide. And they like this one the most as well. It's very interesting. Okay, so let's begin. So I'll begin with the poems from the Hindu year. And This is particularly fun to read. This is the Hindu holiday of Diwali, which, as you may know, celebrates the victory of the rescue of Sita when she is captured by the demon Ravana, and she is rescued by her husband Ram. And one of the great traditions is to take a beautiful light, it's the Festival of Lights, a triumph of light over darkness, and put a candle in a leaf and see how far it goes down the river. And it becomes an occasion for philosophical thinking about light and darkness. Looking and watching these rituals became a very interesting space for me to think about how much we think about the abstract idea of ritual and how much we just focus on the material nature of ritual. So this is Diwali at Gangotri. I want to remember the flame floating down in pure abstraction, oval orange heat. I want to recall the mythical memory of Bali crushed, Ram in triumph, encircling Sita. But instead, this small fire encased by leaf presses forward by the violence of torrents so that it finds its own eddies. Still small, it starts down 10,000 feet. I blink as I imagine how it might survive. No mythical memory here, just the sheerness of drop and the chance that the victory of light over darkness is neither in memory nor abstraction, but in that mother's eye as she climbs to her temple, listens to the river, and glimpses the flame. In the flinch of the yogi who breathes in the night and sees the pale flash between snow and bamboo. In the mistake by the child who thinks it a shell and reaches into the river to hold the glow near. Before its leaf finally succumbs to the waves. This next poem is a celebration of the birthday of the Buddha, and it's a meditation on a knife. As you may know, the great Buddhist Emperor Ashoka had a particularly bloody battle in trying to conquer most of India, and in the bloodiness of that battle, he realized that violence was no longer a way for him to create a society, and nonviolence was the way for him to create a society. And so he erected a number of pillars that are carved in stone where the earliest Buddhist principles and edicts about nonviolence are carved. And you can see them all over India. And it is said that the knife is the same knife that he used to kill people was the knife that he used to carve the edicts of nonviolence. Buddha Jayanti, Ashoka at Kalinga. Kalinga is the name of the battle. This weapon cuts too quickly. Flesh folds and falls like teak leaves dropping in monsoon forests, like mangroves bending to the wind. This weapon needs an enemy other than flesh, other than the chests of southern princes. Perhaps air and breath, perhaps stone and script. To swing this weapon through the air is to injure myself in a circle. To swing this weapon through stone is to injure myself in a line. I will breathe differently, bonded to air. I will write differently, grieving on stone. Then this weapon will have better enemies. This is the title poem of this book, Fire's Gold. And it's based on the Hindu legend of the Rishi Shringa, Shadabanga. And Shadabanga, the sage, had a vision of Ram. The god Ram came to him in the forest, and he was so overwhelmed that when Ram left him, he could not bear the loneliness. And so the idea is that he meditated, and in meditating, he self-combusted. The heat was so great that he burned himself. And as a result, he ascended to heaven to join the God that he longed for. So this is a poem about self-combustion and heat and despair. The Ramayana reports your self-combustion as an act of devotion. Since Rama could not go to heaven with you, Perhaps out of loneliness you burned yourself. Flames came from within and everyone stared. 18th century newspapers told of women who drank alone in their room and were found burned from within, while the furniture remained untouched by the flames. Longing for God, longing for company. If desire is not met by substance, it turns back on itself and the subject burns. Breath becomes smoke, flesh becomes flame. As the body disappears, despair finds relief in a perfect balance of elements. The second half of these poems are based on more using traditional Indian imagery to connect with the contemporary world. A lot of times you feel like ancient India is encrusted in the past, and I wanted to really unsettle people and think about how some of these very venerated traditions were also relevant to the contemporary world. There is a Hindu idea of the sacred thread, which is what Brahmins wear to become learned, and women are now being inducted in sacred thread ceremonies in a wonderful way. And so to take on a sacred thread is to commit to learning and to commit to becoming learned. And so this is a meditation on that idea. This is called Sacred Thread or Spider at Sunrise. 10 red petals and a fly swing in your web, and you hover over the expanse of morning silk, caught between storage and display. Will you eat the petals too, wrapping the fly like a betel nut? Or will you let them swing and happily drop as your web dries? The soul's work is to tell the difference between eating and contemplation. This is a morning poem for a father. One of the things that you see a lot in India is the morning rituals that occur at the banks of rivers where people offer the ashes of their loved ones to the river. And I always wonder what's going on in people's minds as they watch the ashes float away. So this is called Offering for a Father. You never liked mangoes. They sat on the printed tablecloth near your elbow, close to your scowl and the last of the yogurt. A year after your death, I offer them with the carnations. I must honor your aversions and your silences, and not the shapes of my own forgetting. Mangoes hover on the Yamuna as I reassemble your form in fruits and garlands and whirls of ashes congealed in the current. The colors come together in the backwater. They form a face, then disperse, with no remains except my memory. This too was the play of our looks across the table when you were alive. This was a poem read at the Inauguration, which was truly wonderful, by my friend Natasha Trethway. And it's about learning language, and particularly learning a sacred language like Hebrew or Sanskrit and how difficult it can be. On learning a sacred language in childhood. What you remember, a verb and how it collided with a crow alighting on the tree behind your mother's head. A noun and how it spilled off the spoon falling from your brother's mouth. A sentence and its chill, like the chill of your teacher's hand on your shoulder. You keep the books now near your body. They curl and cry and will not let you forget their embrace. Their nouns and verbs break open your silence. Their sentences nag like children wanting a drink. You try to quiet them, but they refuse. They are the hopes and disturbances of your wizened sleep. And I'll end this part of the book with the two Sanskrit poems. I practice, actually I'll just read one of them. I practice in Sanskrit. There is a moment when you end a poem so that the last line actually changes everything about the poem and you have to go back and read it again. And that's a Bengali tradition that's really wonderful. It's called the signature, the key signature. So when I was writing these poems in Sanskrit, I decided to try that. So this is called Heirloom, Vansha Boja, and I'll read it in Sanskrit first. Kalayodhapi me katvastambhe udbhayate yatra tvam esham adadhat karnikodyapi me nikolad lolati yatra te hastad agalat mathabhya gachati mam braviti bhushanemano dehiti. Heirloom. My bracelet still hangs on the bedpost where you placed it. My earring still dangles from the sheet where it fell from your hand. My mother visits and tells me I must take better care of my jewelry. So the Jewish poems, I'll just do a few of these and then a couple from the house and then we'll talk. The thing that was very interesting and challenging about these poems is there are some really tough passages that you remember and you think, okay, well, these tough passages that I'm remembering are what I'm going to write the poem about. So I'll begin with one that you can imagine. And yet became a very transformative act in writing this poem. This is from Exodus 35, 1-2. Moses then called together the whole Israelite community and said to them, "These are the things that the Lord has commanded to do. On 6 days may work be done, but on the 7th day you shall have a Sabbath of complete rest, holy to the Lord. Whoever does any work on the Sabbath day shall be put to death." Exodus 35, 1-2. The rabbis rush to say that we don't really die if we work on Shabbat. They were sure that the second soul who arrives on that day dies instead. What does a second soul look like? Not a gray, gentle man who comes to the door with a sad smile and leaves just as politely in a whisper through the fog. No, my second soul is crouching now under my chair, a panting animal for whom breath and rest and sun are the same. Such a creature does not go lightly, but dances to every tune offered up by the wind. The other challenge was writing about Leviticus, laws, substances, makes you want to have a cookie and take a nap sometimes when you're reading. And yet, as I got into Leviticus, I realized substances, honey, right? Mold, all these wonderful things. And we are, so there's this wonderful Levitical law about what you do with mold in your house. And I did not write this in Vermont, but you will understand when I start to read the poem why it's so wonderful to be able to read this poem in Vermont near our wonderful ancestor, Mr. Frost. So the Levitical passage is, "He shall examine the mark of the house. If the mark on the wall of the house consists in penetrating streaks that are bright green or bright red, which appear to be below the surface of the wall. The priest shall then leave the entrance of the house, quarantine the house for 7 days, and on the 7th day he shall return to examine whether or not the mark has expanded on the wall of the house." Something there is that loves a wall. The twilight sounds between beam and plaster, the ghost of damp feet, dropped seed and shredded twig. I listen when the moon cannot comfort. While they build nests, I speak to them in the dark and they answer, rustling. Their messages are authorless, like the heart-shaped stain on the ceiling or the music in the water pipe. It is better not to specify them as genus or species or furry or scaled. Something there is that loves a wall, and the subject of that sentence shall remain open as their caverns of delight. This is a poem about depression, and my beloved relative's attempt throughout my life to overcome it. And you would not think that this Levitical passage would be the inspiration for it, but you'll see. The land shall be, this is from Leviticus 25, the land shall not be sold in perpetuity, for the land is mine, and you are strangers and settlers with me. All the beaches should be free, she would say, while she left her latest dark dream on the kitchen counter behind her and walked toward the seaweed and the snails, the next homes to welcome her. All the beaches should be free, she would say, while she spread her arms wide in hope of gathering up the waves and the clouds together, like the first pillows to be thrown into an empty waiting room. All the beaches should be free, she would say, and she would speak to me of possible worlds that vanquish noonday demons, where fishes govern in harmony with ospreys, and bankers and sailors cast an equal vote with seals. Perhaps you are right, I would say. Perhaps there is a better cure in the cool democracy of a shoreline, in the acceptance of driftwood, and the open chorus of faraway voices playing over the welcoming strand. And this last Jewish poem, and then I'll get to a couple house poems and then we'll open it up, is about doorposts. And again, wonderful passage known to all of you. That's the other challenge, is when the passage you can't forget is the passage that is not obscure and fun to write about, but one everyone knows, and then you feel completely weighed down by the past, and then you have to transcend it in writing a poem that isn't trite, and then you feel weighed down by that task, and eventually you get there. This is Deuteronomy. And you shall write them, these statements, upon the doorpost of your house and upon your gates, that your days may be multiplied, and the days of your children, upon the land which the Lord swore to your fathers to give them, as the days of the heaven above the earth. There is a lightness when we cross a threshold. Wood frames sunk into soft soil, steel frames of old tenements that have carried the weight of slow, sad steps above them. Sometimes even a mezuzah points upward like a finger. No matter the sorrow, every door holds a hope of difference, of newness, the thought that our days will multiply. And then anticipation splinters into the past of a room where we have to come to terms with objects. Take, for instance, the kitchen. The way my eye catches the light on the grapes, like the boat shells gathered in your hands at the lowest of tides. Or the way the bowls tilt, like the heads of seals who watched us clapping on Barnacle Rock. Or the way the rims of the wine glasses curve like the ripples of your paddle dipping near Seaweed Island. In this doorway, pieces of the summer before you died multiply like so many days of a future. A past hauled up from the zero of forgetting into the more than one of surprised memory. Yes, says the red and peeling paint of the cheerful frame, our days will multiply, and they do so in both directions. So, last couple on house, and then we can talk. So this is, my friends, I said this is my secular thing. My friends call this my Sufi book. Who knows what it is? And these are straightforward stuff, no religious, no nothing. No tradition, just house. And Gaston Bachelard in Poetics of Space, if you haven't read it or reread it recently, it's a brilliant, wonderful book. My inspirations here are very straight architectural forms. Window. He landed in the storm and spread his moth wings on the dark window. His underbelly was the size of my finger. He pulsed green, then blue, then orange. I put my hand on the glass. His wings trembled, and then I tapped on the pane. This is not a source of light, I whispered. This is just a dark window. He was still there in the morning. His wings had withstood the night, his colors finely dusted by the winds. All right, I said to him, this is not just a dark window. It is a source of light I cannot see. Floor. This is in honor of Job, so I couldn't quite let go of the Bible yet. After he smears his face with ash and presses his cheek to the floor, what does Job see? Perhaps he is given the eyes of a child. The whorls in the wooden planks become traces of wind, and the lines between the tiles are teeming roads trafficked by mites. Perhaps such tiny worlds are the only ones that grief can see when the human-sized weight of loss pushes us groundward. This is the fountain. On the day after I die and my heart finally escapes its beautiful cage, its pulses scattered to the winds, let the young woman watching the fountain that morning see a sudden surge of splash and color and greet it with jubilation as if it were lava or witch's brew. Let the little man who opens the drawbridge at high noon turn the crank one more time, his body a happy flag on the lever as the gulls sing the boats through. Let last year's ghost, waiting by the bed that night, finally quicken her lover's dreams so that he turns in his sleep and curls his hand around nothing in particular. Let my heart roam free, for it has been pounding against these bars for so long. House. On a train in a place where I knew some but not all of the words, I saw yellow flowers spiraling off the embankment. As they sped by, I wanted to say forsythia, but they could have been gorse or daylily or snapdragon, and I would have struggled for those words too. And then it appeared in the green swathes of the window, a white house, perfect as a pocket. And I knew behind its sweet walls there were aunts waiting and cousins who bounced balls in greeting, and steaming baths and wet footprints on tiles, and vines whose tendrils curled like small hands around fences. The infinite second exploded then. The train flew on, and I watched the flowers mutely, still unable to utter their name. And this one is Shed, in honor of Thoreau. When she turned 80, we looked together for white lady slippers near Thoreau's cabin. It's just a shed, she told me. The lady slippers are the thing. When she lost her breath from the climb, she didn't speak of it. The white slippers nodded and swayed at her quiet gasping. I wondered whether Henry David inspired her silence. All his writing coming down a century later to the single thing she could not say. His prayer that a dignified life has as its primary end a dignified death, where streams ask us to follow them, their branches and eddies, like his main canoe, helpless and serene. I looked down at the forest floor, noting that her stockings matched the pine. We'll stop there, talk for a little bit.
Especially thank you for reading from the work in progress. You'll probably have lots of time to finish that.
Yes, tons.
Thoughts, questions, requests?
I have a question. In the introduction to the Bhagavad Gita, you said that you had opted to translate it as poetry rather than prose.
Yes.
And could you say a little bit about that and why?
Absolutely. So it was the 251st translation into English of Bhagavad Gita. So are there any good intellectual reasons to translate the text? And the answer could be no. Right? And it's better if you're honest about that. I also felt, talk about being oppressed by tradition, people would come up to me and say, oh, you're writing the definitive translation. Is this going to be the definitive translation? And I immediately felt oppressed. No, it's not. It's just going to be another one. Publishing houses like generational newness. So at that point, 10 years ago, I was a younger female scholar, and I think I was maybe the second or third woman to translate the Gita. And so it became clear to me that I couldn't do anything big and definitive, nor was that my job. My job was to see if there was anything in the Gita that hadn't been pulled out in a way that would be interesting for people to see. And I was a poet, and I wanted to do that. So the more I looked at it, and the more I looked at other translations, they're mostly translated as philosophy, and not really as poetry. And I thought, well, is it really true that philosophy and poetry are inimical to each other? Maybe they're not. And lots of people have tried to put them together in some way or other. So I thought maybe it would be wonderful to think of it first as poetry and try to make the philosophical language as poetic as it could be and still be accurate. And so that was the reason. And also I loved the concreteness of the language. Even with the philosophy, the language is unbelievably beautifully concrete. I'll give you an example. In Sanskrit, asit, asinat is frequently translated as I sit removed, I sit indifferent, and so on. But the actual Sanskrit is I sit, asinat, as one sitting apart. And that's a beautiful poetic line. I sit, but as one sitting apart. Or another one, patanga, it's a Sanskrit compound, moth. It means literally flying goer. And I'm like, I'm not just doing moth, because it's so beautiful, it's a flying goer. So I've translated there, moths that fly to their full. And so there's a beautiful sense of concrete imagery and poetry, even in the Gita, that it felt like the right thing to do. And the thing that's so wonderful about doing a Penguin translation is you get emails from everywhere. In my introduction, I talked about, I hope that pilots use this and housewives in London use this. I got a very sweet note from somebody who said, we started a housewives group in London about your Gita because you said that we should do that. I didn't mean to create one, but that's what, and they had questions. My favorite was another guy who said, I knew that the Gita was my text. I'm a Hindu. I wanted to read it, and he joined an ashram, Japanese by ethnicity. And I just started to read, and it literally fell from my hands and in my tears. And I thought somehow, for some reason, the choice of poetry for him got the essence of the poem. A couple people said that I was too quietistic, and I wasn't violent enough in my translation of the war elements. Yeah, so I'm going to have that critique. That's a good one to have.
May I ask, when did you first know you were a poet?
I was about 5. I mean, I really knew it, and which is why I still feel like my life is in a certain way a failure of courage to just do that. But one of my heroines is Ruth Stone, who was like 70, said, yeah, I should have been, not I should have been, but I'm going to be that poet. And I remember resolutely walking into the University of Chicago to decide to go there for graduate school. And my first Sanskrit teacher and saying, I'm not a scholar, I'm a writer getting scholarly skills. Just did a little bit of a detour there. But so I tend to surround myself with people who remind me that that's really what I am more than anything else. But it does mean things like, if you're a poet, you have an ethics of language. And it means that when you write things like memos, which I have to do a lot of, how do you take care of the language? So often, it's so hard to do that. How can you, if you have to write memos that, there's nothing soulful about them, but you have to do that, how can you compensate for that by being as present to people as you possibly can be when you actually meet them? There's those kinds of things that a poet in the world can take care of, even if she's not necessarily writing a poem every day. But unbelievably, the poetry, when I became a dean at Duke, poetry survived and poetry continues. I mean, how could you not in a glorious place like Middlebury? It's very good place to continue to write. And you feel like you actually finish stuff, because it's not like my other project is a translation of the Mahabharata now. Just a small little thing. Don't ask me why I did that, but I feel better when I finish a poem.
Thank you.
I found your poetry very powerful and moving. And for some reason the expression came to my mind that you took no prisoners, which was ironic given the reference that your translation wasn't violent enough. But in the spirit of something you said in your inauguration that I continue to chew on, the idea of engaging in argument for the sake of heaven.
Yes,
I felt I needed to try to do it in my question for you now.
sure.
And that is, one of the first things you said, and that expression, failure of nerve, has always resonated for me as an existential philosopher and psychologist. And then I remembered I've become a little bit of a Laurie Patton, I think, because I've been to many of your events. And when you had that wonderful event of where you're sitting talking to John Isham about
Yeah,
what
the
matters most to you.
Yeah.
And you recommended that the most important thing for a person to do is find a question to ask every day of their life they can't answer. If I
Right.
recall correctly, I apologize if I modified it, was how does the poet bring about change in the world?
Yeah, what's the role of poet in society, yeah.
So then your disparagement of Barbara the bureaucrat,
Right, I
and
know.
if you had more nerve that you would do poetry all the time.
Right.
And I thought if I connected the dots, isn't being a poet like yourself and being willing to take on the asimilar task, and you just a few moments ago seemed to answer the way you did memos and things like that,
Yeah.
isn't that the opposite? It takes the most nerve for a poet to enter the world as the poet and to deal with all of the base and trivial and material stuff
Yes.
and do it through the vision and the soul of the poet.
Yes, yes, that would be the flip positive side, exactly right. I think that's true.
You feel free to argue with me if I'm giving it a good face and you don't.
No, I think you're right, and I think on good days I would agree with you. It's true. I think, I decided to go to administrative work because I thought, does the world need my 60-second article on early Indian poetry? And the answer is yes, totally the world needs that. But does it need it as much as a really, driven, visionary, imperfect, but wants to make the academy more humane college president? No. It's much better for me to be doing this. But, I guess we're all haunted by Kant, the purity of heart is to will one thing. Kierkegaard, excuse me, Kierkegaard.
We spoke about that.
Kierkegaard, the purity of heart is to will one thing. And so I think what I envy and perhaps think of as better, more singular courage is that sense of committing to the writing, no matter what. And so I'm not sure, I think you're absolutely right that it's probably not better or worse than committing to a humane academy no matter what. And that's the deepest commitment, of course, that I have, is that. And using the role and commitments of a poet to do that, which is, I think, another way of saying what you said. I think that's wonderful. I think it's more, if I put it in a lighter way, I would say that I envy those who are committed to the writing no matter what.
So to do what you're doing seems to be, I forget if it's Kierkegaard, it's like it's living a contradiction.
Yeah, it is, and that's what good metaphor is. So, you can sort of say that you're living in your own metaphor of retention.
And one which ideally I would imagine could transform the academy in a way that it desperately needs.
I hope so. That's the idea, anyway. That's the idea.
Yes, you tell me your first mentor.
Yes, my first mentor was a wonderful woman, and I was just back at my high school last, I'm assuming you mean poetic mentor, because I can give you the
Yes.
others too.
Oh, okay, yes,
Yeah.
you're poetic.
Poetic mentor was a woman named Melinda Talkington. She was my poetry teacher in high school at Joe Rosemary Hall. She was an alcoholic, she never took a bath. She taught me about sestinas, she taught me about verse form, she taught me about HD, introduced me to HD, one of my favorite symbolist poets. She made me realize that I probably was gonna be a symbolist poet. She made me write poetry as a discipline, no matter what. And it didn't matter what you brought into her apartment or her classroom, it was all poetry all the time. And I remember being just so transformed by that. My mentor that was probably most influential was, of course, my graduate advisor, Wendy Doneger. Still alive, I just edited her Festschrift, a congratulatory volume about 4 years ago. A woman who was a dancer and became an incredibly renowned woman Sanskritist 2 generations above me. And you can imagine what it took to do that. And huge generosity of heart. And somebody who really understands what it means to have a circle of students in the best sense. So those would be my two.
Could you give me that second name?
Wendy Doniger, Doniger. She is not uncontroversial.
Thank you.
You mentioned Ruth Stone, did you ever meet her?
I never met Ruth Stone, I just admired her from afar.
She read here
Did she
once.
read here? How cool is that, am I sitting in Ruth Stone?
It was
And her
wonderful.
granddaughter Bianca is reading next week.
Oh, wonderful, I'd love to meet her. That'd be very cool. I'd love that. We can finish up, I think we need to finish in a little bit.
We've got time to get on, so.
Yeah, one more question, then I'm gonna read 2 pairs of poems.
I'm aware that Sanskrit and English, as I understand it, share some common roots, and I don't know anything about Hebrew in terms of common roots.
Right. So I'm not a historical linguist. I played one on TV for many years. So the Indo-European, the closest Indo-European languages morphologically, oddly enough, are the ones that are the most distant in time. So Old Irish and Sanskrit. I began at Harvard as a Celtic Studies minor. So Old Irish poetry is like a lot of symbolist poetry. It's beautiful. And the Celtic Studies Old Irish has many mythological and grammatical constructs that are almost identical to Sanskrit, early Vedic Sanskrit. And so that's because they're the 2 most conservative outposts of Indo-European civilization, which means that, like if you have Bartoli's law on linguistics suggests that if you have 2 languages on the outside of a town, they're going to look more like each other, even though they're farther apart than in the middle, because all of the languages are, influencing each other. So I got fascinated by that. And so Hittite is the closest Semitic language that we have, classed as quasi-Semitic language that we have to, and it is an Indo-European language. If you look at what we have in Hittite and inscriptions and so on, you can see Indo-European deities and roots of words and so on. But there are only 2 words that I know of that maybe have a connection between Sanskrit and Hebrew, and it would be probably through a Middle Eastern language like Hittite or Old Iranian. And the first word is Ug, and that's the Ugaritic word for fire, and Agni is the word in Sanskrit for fire. That's the main one. There could be another one, Nasha, which is snake, but and in Sanskrit is Naga. There are all sorts of weird etymologies that people who, Hindus are obsessed with Jews or Jews are obsessed with Hindus, make, like Brahma, the deity, the great deity beyond all deities, or principle that animates everything, the force. And Abraham, there's all those things, and it's hard to take them seriously. Maybe someday we'll discover a rock that has everything around it. But generally speaking, those are forced etymologies, as I put it. That sounds really obnoxious and scholarly, but you did ask. So. One more question, then I'll do the poems.
I actually hate to ask this question. You may actually hate to answer it too.
No.
But as some doing translations, reflection, and also inspiration from sacred texts, do you think being a woman makes a difference in how you respond and move with the language? I'm not asking about as a poet, but I can't separate those, but as a woman?
Yeah. Yes, I think it does, partly because my metaphor for things in life that are transformational is gardening. I think there's a genderedness to my reaction, which was negative to, aren't you going to make the definitive translation? And I don't say that there's anything essentially real about that question, but I think almost all of the people who ask me that were men, and I know that the sociology of knowledge is such that I prefer a different kind of knowing and a different way of thinking about what my contribution is going to look like. So in that way, yes. I also think that, I think everyone has to overcome self-doubt. I think the how dare you question that you have before you write is differently configured, I think, for women than men. And that has to do with the wonderful studies that are recently out there about women's speech in public. And Mary Barrett has this wonderful essay about women speaking and how difficult it has been from the Greek times onwards. And there's a couple of studies now about how women are experienced in meetings and whether they talk too much, and most of the time it's, if you talk over 30% in a meeting, and you're a woman, you talk too much, and then it's over 70%. So, I mean, this is a study that just came out.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the reason why I mention that is only because I think I'm doing a large-scale study of women Sanskritists, and they don't mind speaking in public. They're going to be spectacles a little bit, speaking Sanskrit in public, but when it comes to publishing their work, say it's unbecoming of a woman to self-advertise. And so there's all these different dynamics about what it means for women to write and speak and to be in public. And I think that does get caught up. So for me, it's about being quiet and dignified and inspirational and there, and never letting go of the fact that I'm also a woman. It's a very hard balance to do that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay? Yeah, so I thought, this is the first time I've done this, and it was stupid that I've never done it before, but it was such a great audience. This, Barbara knows this, that I sometimes think I've forgotten to do something when I did it last week. And so, and this is a lot of stuff going on. So I realized that I'm obsessed with Noah. And so I wrote 2 poems about Noah, and I didn't realize. And then one from this place, and then one from the other. And then I also have, I wrote 2 poems that I totally didn't realize about 7 mothers. So in India, there's a tradition of Saptamatrika, which are 7 mothers. And the 7 mothers in India are ones that help give birth. And so the poem I'm going to read, I wrote 2 poems about 7 mothers that I didn't realize when I wrote the second one that I'd already written one about India. And then I'll read the 2 poems about Noah. So this is about giving birth and the idea that every single mother in the Hindu pantheon, this goddess, could help you give birth. And this is based on the prayer of a woman who honors the 7 mothers as she's giving birth, because she keeps giving birth to stillborn babies, and she doesn't want to have stillborn babies anymore. Mother, you are not birth, but half birth. Listen as I tell you, stopped at the temple, building my fruit offerings. My name is Videha. I have no body, or else too much body. I bled children, flesh that did not breathe. But look, mother, I have made lack a virtue, pots, clay wounds arranged before you, and 7 flower statues in all your forms. With this flower I will call you by all of your names, and you will answer piece by piece. You will reassemble the body of half-births into a towering whole. Brahmi filled my mouth with searing speech, singing labor songs as the child kicks its way towards breath. Maheshwari, brass goddess, ring metal bells filling my ears as the labor song runs. Kaumari, wife of battle, hold my back where the spear strikes as the child crowns. Vaishnavi, make your omens arc in the sky so that I can see them as I arch upward. Varahi, you have held the earth before, make it still as the child falls. Indrani, play with him, flirt and run, so that he is teased into breathing. Chamunda, leather worker, wrap him in your skin, so that he knows the feel of covering. All of you, 7 mothers, name this birthing body, claim this flesh as your own. Perhaps then, named by you, he will stay. He will be a true offering. And this is called Stair. This is the most recent. Photographs of our mothers follow the staircase, 6 generations of them. Some wear bridal lace, others twinkle, others look grim. Smiling has only been customary in the last 2 generations. In our nightly ascent toward dreams, we count 7 pine planks. Each step cradles our feet. A mother is with us each time we bend our knees. As we climb, we choose a single act from the multitude that propelled their days. Step 1. This mother never spoke of her divorce from the husband who went to jail for disorderly conduct. Step 2. This mother drew beautifully and went away for a long time, so no one knew where she was. Step 3. This mother tried to play the piano, but took refuge in Adam's nervine to recover her wits. Step 4, this mother sometimes peeked under the bed to look at the whip her father kept, just in case. Step 5, this mother was afraid to go out of the house where the wide open spaces could kill. Step 6, this mother ate so little, she thought she had mastered the universe. Step 7, a landing before we make the final climb towards sleep and sky. There we sit and ponder the maternal possibilities. So then we'll do Noah, and we'll call it a day. Okay, so this Noah is from the last book, and it's called Hallway. My mother and I have been having a conversation. Noah's Ark stands at the end of our hallway, doll-sized in painted pine. The Noah doll leans on the gunnel, his arms outstretched. My mother had arranged all the animals in straight rows of pairs. That way, at the end of the hall, past the rugs and the old stoves and encyclopedias with fraying corners, my mother sees order. They like being in rows, she says, and Noah is orchestrating all of them inside. One night, I snuck down and made chaos instead. I piled zebras on turtles and twisted geese over tigers and separated rabbits from their mates, and I made them run in all directions. Noah is desperately trying to get their attention, I told my mother. That way, at the end of the hall, past the old planks and brass lamps and straight curtains, I see effort and sweat and the longing to bring panicked creatures in from the storm. I learned later that there were no windows in the ark, but only a pearl that glowed by day so everyone could see. What we see at the end of the hall is the difference between rest and restlessness, nightmare and dreams. And this is Midrash on Noah. And this is the line when Noah is discovered drunk and naked after the flood is over. And the Bible doesn't tell us why Noah is drunk and naked. So this is an attempt to answer why Noah is drunk and naked. And Noah the husband began and planted a vineyard, and he drank of the wine and was drunken, and he was uncovered within his tent. Genesis 9:20-21. And this is in his voice. I couldn't stop the memory. Wine was the only way, and lying without my robe a small price to pay for oblivion from the flashes. On the boat's threshold, wet fur is filling my nostrils, a stampeding, screeching stench of feathers and flanks, the odor more ominous because the rain has already started, and they keep coming in their swaggering stink, each with breath in their nostrils, as the Lord said. And the ropes come off, and I lean over the gunnel, swaying 30 cubits high, while inside their hissing and spitting drones on with the roar of the thunder. And then I hear the screams of the ones left behind, and I see them on the shore, struggling in the trees and flapping in the soil and racing toward us, eyes wide and wild and white. There was breath in their nostrils too, as the Lord said. They are racing toward us, and our pale outlines are their last glimpse of survival. My hand grips the gunnel, and I stand frozen, swaying 30 cubits high, watching the steaming boil of terrified life. And their outlines then burn into memory as I turn away forever.